For over 17 years, a homeless man wandered the streets, enduring daily humiliation and rejection from a society that saw him as nothing but a burden. His weathered cardboard sign reading, "Used to be someone," held a profound truth that passers-by ignored, never bothering to uncover the story behind those haunting words. But on one fateful afternoon, as he rested on his usual bench, everything changed when a black SUV pulled up and a well-dressed man stepped out, a moment that would bridge the gap between his past and future. What shocking secret lay behind the words on his cardboard sign, and how would a black SUV's arrival change everything? Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. John Turner, a 62-year-old homeless man, stood on the roadside of a bustling shopping center area. His gaunt frame and sunken eyes told the story of days without food, his once sturdy body now reduced to skin and bones. In his trembling hands, he held a cardboard sign that read, "Used to be someone." The irony of those words wasn't lost on him as he watched the steady stream of people passing by, their eyes averting his gaze. As John stood there, hoping for a kind soul to spare some change, a well-dressed man approached. For a brief moment, John's spirits lifted, thinking this might be his lucky break. But as the man drew closer, a sneer spread across his face. "Used to be someone, huh?" the man mocked, his voice dripping with disdain. "I doubt someone like you used to be anyone, you loser." With a cruel laugh and a swift kick, the man sent John's begging cup flying, scattering the meager collection of coins across the sidewalk. John watched in dismay as his only means of sustenance rolled away, some disappearing into nearby storm drains, others wedging between cracks in the pavement. Laughter echoed in John's ears as he slowly lowered himself to the ground, his arthritic joints protesting with each movement. His weakened eyesight made the task of finding the scattered coins even more challenging. As he fumbled around, feeling for the cold metal discs, he could hear the man's continued taunts. "Look at you crawling around like a pathetic worm," the man sneered. "This is where you belong, in the gutter with the rest of the trash." John tried to block out the cruel words, focusing instead on retrieving what little he had. It took several long, humiliating minutes before he managed to collect most of the coins. By the time he finished, the man had walked away, leaving John with nothing but the sting of his words and the ache in his bones. Realizing that this spot would yield no kindness, John gathered his few possessions and began to walk. His steps were slow and unsteady, each one a reminder of how far he had fallen. As he moved along the sidewalk, he passed a hot dog stand, the aroma of grilled meat making his empty stomach growl painfully. Mustering what little courage he had left, John approached the vendor. "Excuse me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you have any leftovers, anything at all? I have a little money." He held out his hand, showing the few coins he had managed to collect. The hot dog vendor barely glanced at John's outstretched hand before waving him away. "Not enough," he grunted. "And I don't serve your kind. You're scaring away my customers. Get lost." Dejected, John shuffled away from the stand. His parched throat ached, reminding him of his thirst. Spotting a water fountain nearby, he made his way over, grateful for at least this small mercy. As John bent to drink from the fountain, he became aware of a presence beside him. A young mother stood there, holding the hand of her toddler son. The boy was clutching an empty water bottle, clearly waiting for his turn at the fountain. John straightened up, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He tried to smile at the little boy, raising his hand in a small wave. "Hello there, little fella," he said softly. The mother's reaction was immediate and harsh. She yanked her son back, her face contorted with disgust. "Don't look at him, sweetie," she hissed, loud enough for John to hear. "Come on, we'll fill your bottle somewhere else." As the mother hurried away with her child, John's shoulders slumped even further. He had long ago lost count of how many times he'd been treated like a monster, something to be feared and avoided. But it never got easier. With his thirst somewhat quenched, John crossed the street, his eyes fixed on a park in the distance. The promise of a shady bench called to him, offering a moment's respite from the unforgiving sun and the even more unforgiving stares of passers-by. As he settled onto the cool wooden slats of the bench, John let out a heavy sigh. He watched the world go by, joggers, dog walkers, families out for a stroll, all living lives he could barely remember having. The normalcy of it all felt like a cruel joke, a reminder of everything he had lost. Lost in his thoughts, John was startled by the sound of children's voices nearby. He turned to see a group of kids, probably on a school trip, pointing in his direction. "Why is that man so ugly?" one child asked loudly. "He lives on the street," another replied. "My dad says only crazy people do that." A third child, bolder than the rest, suggested, "Should we scare him? I bet he'd run away." Before the children could act on their cruel impulses, their teacher noticed what was happening. She quickly ushered the group away, but not before shooting John a look of pure revulsion, as if his mere presence was contaminating her charges. Years ago, such encounters would have left John feeling angry or deeply saddened, but now he felt nothing. The realization that he had become so numb to humiliation scared him more than any harsh word or disgusted look ever could. As the sun began to rise, casting its bright rays of light across the park, John found himself wondering how much longer he could bear this existence. What was the point of continuing on when each day brought nothing but pain and rejection? The world had made it clear that it had no place for him, no use for a broken-down old man with nothing left to offer. Tears began to fall, silent drops that carved paths through the grime on his cheeks. John's body curled in on itself, his head dropping to his chest, as the weight of his despair became too much to bear. In that moment, on a park bench surrounded by the bustle of life going on around him, John Turner felt truly and utterly alone. As John sat slumped on the park bench, consumed by despair, a new sound broke through the city's background hum. The soft strumming of guitar strings drifted through the midday air, pulling his focus away from his troubled thoughts. Lifting his head, John's tear-stained eyes searched for the source of the music. Not far from his bench, a young man was setting up a small performance area. An acoustic guitar hung from a strap around his neck, and he was fiddling with a portable speaker. At his feet lay an open guitar case, ready to receive donations from any appreciative listeners. Curiosity piqued, John watched as the young musician finished his preparations. The first few chords rang out clearly, and John felt a jolt of recognition. It was a melody he knew well, one that had been a favorite in his younger days. As the song progressed, John found himself mouthing the words along with the performer. "Used to be someone," he whispered, the irony of the title not lost on him. The lyrics spoke of lost identity and faded glory, themes that resonated deeply with John's current situation. The song transported John back to a different time, a different life. He remembered listening to this very tune on the radio while driving to work, humming it while doing chores around the house, even singing it to his young son as a lullaby. Those memories, long buried under years of hardship and despair, bubbled to the surface, bringing with them a bittersweet ache. As the final notes faded away, John felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a genuine connection to another human being, even if it was just through a shared appreciation of music. Without thinking, he rose from the bench and approached the young musician. Digging into his pocket, John pulled out one of his precious dollar bills. It was wrinkled and worn, much like John himself, but it was all he had to offer. With a trembling hand, he dropped the bill into the open guitar case. "Keep it, son," John said, his voice rough with emotion. "You've entertained my soul, even if just for a moment." The young musician looked up, surprise evident on his face. He hadn't expected a donation from someone who so clearly had little to spare. "Thank you, sir," he said sincerely. "I'm glad you enjoyed it." John nodded, a ghost of a smile flickering across his weathered face. For a brief instant, he felt like a person again, not just a nameless, faceless, homeless man. But the feeling was fleeting, and as he turned away from the musician, the weight of his reality settled back onto his shoulders. With the sun climbing toward its highest point, John's stomach clenched painfully, reminding him he hadn't eaten yet since morning. He recalled an alley behind a nearby supermarket, where he occasionally found discarded but still edible food. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than going hungry. With heavy steps, John made his way out of the park and across the street. The city around him buzzed with the midday rush, storefronts bustling and the crowd moving with purpose. John felt invisible as he navigated through the throngs of people, a shadow passing unnoticed in the bright, busy day. As he approached the alley, John's hopes for a meal were quickly dashed. Another homeless man was already there, elbow deep in the dumpster, searching for anything of value. John hesitated, not wanting to start a confrontation over territory. In his weakened state, he knew he wouldn't stand a chance if things turned physical. While John lingered at the mouth of the alley, trying to decide what to do and where to go, the back door of the supermarket burst open. The store manager stormed out, his face red with anger. "Get out of here, you filthy bum!" the manager shouted, advancing on the man at the dumpster. "How many times do I have to tell you to stay away from my store?" The homeless man tried to scramble away, but the manager was quicker. He grabbed the man by his tattered coat and shoved him roughly to the ground. "If I see you here again, I'm calling the cops," the manager threatened, punctuating his words with a kick to the fallen man's side. The scene unfolding before John triggered something deep within him. Suddenly, he wasn't in a city alley anymore. He was back in Afghanistan, surrounded by the chaos and violence of war. The sounds of the city faded away, replaced by the rattling of gunfire and the screams of his fellow soldiers. John's legs gave out from under him, and he collapsed to the dirty pavement. His breath came in short, panicked gasps as the flashback overwhelmed him. He could smell the acrid scent of gunpowder, feel the oppressive heat of the desert sun beating down on him. The commotion drew the manager's attention. Leaving the other homeless man to scurry away, he turned his ire on John. "Another one," he growled, stomping over to where John lay trembling on the ground. "What is this, a convention of street rats?" Grabbing John by his loose, ragged clothes, the manager hauled him to his feet. "Get out of here, all of you," he shouted, giving John a hard shove that sent him stumbling backward. The force of the push caused John's already threadbare shirt to tear, exposing his bony chest to the heat of the afternoon air. As John struggled to regain his balance, still caught between the present moment and his wartime memories, he heard the manager's parting words. "Damn homeless people, you're like sewer rats. More of you every month, and you just keep coming back no matter how many times I chase you off." The manager's voice faded as he retreated back into the store, leaving John alone in the alley. Slowly, reality began to reassert itself. The sounds of war gave way to the familiar urban symphony of traffic and distant conversations. But the fear and adrenaline from the flashback lingered, leaving John shaken and disoriented. With his torn shirt flapping in the breeze and his stomach still achingly empty, John stumbled away from the alley. He had no destination in mind, no plan beyond putting distance between himself and the sight of his latest humiliation. As he wandered the heartless streets, John felt more lost and alone than ever, a man out of place in both time and society. John's aimless wandering through the city streets led him to a familiar sight, the neon glow of a liquor store sign. The bottles displayed in the window seemed to call out to him, promising temporary relief from the physical and emotional pain that consumed him. For a moment, John hesitated. He knew all too well the destructive path that alcohol had led him down in the past. It had cost him his family, his home, his dignity. But in this moment of desperation, with the lingering effects of his PTSD episode still rattling through his system, the temptation was overwhelming. With a resigned sigh, John pushed open the door to the liquor store. The bell above the door chimed, announcing his presence. The man behind the counter looked up, his expression changing from bored indifference to wary suspicion as he took in John's disheveled appearance. John shuffled to the cooler, his eyes scanning the rows of bottles until they landed on the cheapest beer available. He grabbed a single bottle, the glass cold against his calloused palm, and approached the counter. The clerk watched John's every move, his hand hovering near the silent alarm button beneath the counter. "That'll be $3, he said gruffly, as John placed the bottle on the counter. John dug into his pocket, pulling out the last of his spare coins. These were meant for food, a small voice in the back of his mind reminded him. but the promise of numbness, of a brief respite from the constant barrage of painful memories and current hardships, was too strong to resist. As he counted out the coins, John's hands shook slightly. Whether from withdrawal, hunger, or the lingering effects of his earlier panic attack, he couldn't be sure. The clerk's impatient sigh as John fumbled with the money only added to his sense of shame. Could you open it for me, please?" John asked softly, pushing the coins across the counter. His arthritic fingers, stiff from the fall earlier, would have difficulty with the bottle cap. The clerk rolled his eyes but complied, twisting off the cap with a quick motion. He pushed the open bottle back towards John without a word. "Thank you," John murmured, grasping the bottle. Without waiting for a response, he turned and hurried out of the store, the bell chiming once more as the door swung shut behind him. Once outside, John raised the bottle to his lips and took a long, desperate gulp. The cheap beer was bitter and warm, but he hardly noticed. He was focused solely on the promise of the alcohol's effects, the gradual dulling of his senses that would allow him to forget, if only for a little while. As he walked, John continued to drink, each swallow bringing him closer to the oblivion he craved. By the time he had consumed nearly half of the bottle, a familiar warmth began to spread through his body. The sharp edges of reality started to blur, the constant ache in his joints and his heart beginning to fade. John's feet carried him to a bench in front of a restaurant. The smell of food wafting from the establishment made his empty stomach clench, a painful reminder of his hunger. But the alcohol was doing its job, making it easier to ignore the gnawing emptiness. Lowering himself onto the bench, John exhaled deeply. The world around him seemed to blur slightly, the city's noises muffled, as though he were submerged underwater. It wasn't peace, not truly, but it was the closest John had come to it in a long while. He took another long drink from the bottle and lay back on the bench. As the alcohol continued to work its way through his system, John's eyelids grew heavy. The constant vigilance required for survival on the streets, always being alert for danger or opportunity, began to slip away. Without really meaning to, John found himself adrift to sleep, his body curling in on itself for comfort. The almost empty beer bottle dangled precariously from his fingers, threatening to fall at any moment. But John was beyond caring. As consciousness began to slip away, he welcomed the approaching darkness. In sleep, at least, he could escape the harsh realities of his waking life. Just before he drifted off completely, a fleeting thought passed through John's mind. He knew he shouldn't be sleeping here, that someone from the restaurant would likely chase him away if he was discovered. But the combination of exhaustion, hunger, and alcohol made it impossible to act on this knowledge. True to his guess, a harsh voice jolted him back to awareness as soon as slept engulfed him. No, not again. A man in suit who looked like the restaurant owner or manager had emerged, his face a mask of frustration. "You homeless people are always causing trouble. We've got important investors coming today. You can't sleep here. Move, now." Too tired and too drunk to argue, John simply nodded and stood up. He gathered his few possessions, the cardboard sign, his nearly empty bottle, and shuffled away from the restaurant. He made it only a few meters before his legs gave out, and he sank to the ground, leaning against a nearby wall. As he sat there, John finished the last of his beer. With a sigh, he tossed the empty bottle into a nearby trash bin. Then, using his cardboard sign as a makeshift pillow, he lay down on the hard concrete. The alcohol in his system, combined with sheer exhaustion, quickly pulled John into a deep sleep. As John finally succumbed to sleep, the sounds of the city continued around him. Passers-by hurried past, some casting curious or disgusted glances at the disheveled figure on the street, others deliberately averting their eyes. To most, John was just another fixture of urban decay, as unremarkable as a piece of litter on the sidewalk. In the depths of his alcohol-induced sleep, John's mind wandered through a vivid dreamscape. He found himself back in Afghanistan, the familiar weight of his rifle in his hands and the comforting presence of his fellow soldiers around him. In this dream world, John felt strong again, his body free from the ravages of age and hardship. The scene shifted, and John found himself in the midst of a firefight. His heart raced as he took cover behind a crumbling wall, the sound of gunfire echoing all around him. He raised his rifle, finger poised on the trigger, ready to return fire. But when he pulled the trigger, instead of the expected crack of gunfire, he heard a car horn. The incongruous sound jolted John back to consciousness. He blinked rapidly, disoriented by the sudden transition from war-torn Afghanistan to a city street. The honking continued, insistent and irritating. John realized he was still lying on the bench, his body stiff and aching from the uncomfortable position. Groaning softly, John pushed himself up into a sitting position. He rubbed his eyes, trying to clear the fog of sleep and lingering alcohol from his mind. As his vision came into focus, he noticed two luxury cars pulling up to the curb near his bench. The cars were sleek and shiny, their polished surfaces reflecting the bright afternoon light. John watched as the doors opened, and three men in expensive business suits stepped out. They exuded an air of wealth and importance that made John acutely aware of his own disheveled state. Two of the men walked past John without so much as a glance in his direction. Their conversation continued uninterrupted, as if the homeless man on the sidewalk was nothing more than a piece of the urban landscape. But the third man, who was wearing an emerald blue vest, paused, his hand going to his pocket. John's heart leapt with a mixture of hope and shame as the man pulled out a wallet. He hated having to rely on the charity of strangers, but his empty stomach and the lingering effects of his hangover silenced his pride. The man in the suit extracted a few crisp dollar bills from his wallet and held them out to John. "Here," he said, his voice neutral. "Take this. Get yourself something to eat." John reached out with trembling hands to accept the money. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice rough from sleep and disuse. He looked up, intending to express his gratitude more fully, but the words died in his throat as his eyes met those of his benefactor. The man in the suit froze, his gaze locked on John's face. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, expectation, confusion. John couldn't be sure what the man was waiting from him. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice suddenly uncertain. "I thought you were, never mind." Before John could respond, one of the other men called out, "Hey man, are you coming? We're going to be late for the meeting." The man seemed to shake himself out of his daze. "Right, yes, coming." He turned back to John, a strange expression on his face. "Have a nice day," he said quickly, then hurried to join his companions. John watched as the three men walked towards the restaurant, his mind whirling with questions. Why had the man looked at him that way, and why did those eyes seem so familiar? As the men disappeared into the restaurant, John overheard snippets of their conversation. "Waste of money, these people are all the same. He'll probably use it to buy alcohol." Exactly. Donating to them is pointless. If you want to give, invest in something credible like this restaurant. At least then you'll get a return. John sighed, a mixture of shame and resignation washing over him. He couldn't deny the truth in their words. Hadn't he done exactly that just now, using the money he had for alcohol instead of food? Looking down at the bills in his hand, John was surprised to see 3 crisp $5 notes. The paper felt almost foreign against his rough skin, so used to handling grimy coins and crumpled single dollars. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what he could do with this unexpected windfall. Food was the first thought that came to mind. Real food, not scraps from a dumpster or stale leftovers from a shelter. He thought longingly of the pizza place down a few blocks. 2 slices would be enough to fill his stomach today and save one for tomorrow. He'd even have some change left over for later. As John sat there, planning how to make the most of this unexpected gift, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened. The way that man had looked at him, it was as if he had seen a ghost. Shaking his head to clear these thoughts, John slowly got to his feet. His body protested the movement, joints creaking and muscles aching from the night spent on the hard bench. But the promise of a real meal gave him a spark of energy he hadn't felt in a long time. With one last glance at the restaurant where the businessman had disappeared, John set off down the street. The crisp bills were clutched tightly in his hand, a tangible reminder that sometimes, even in the darkest moments, a small act of kindness could change everything. John's stomach growled loudly as he approached the pizza vendor, the tantalizing aroma of melted cheese and freshly baked dough making his mouth water. It had been so long since he'd had a proper meal, and the prospect of hot, satisfying food was almost overwhelming. As he neared the shop, John noticed a short queue forming at the counter. He took his place at the end of the line, trying to ignore the way people in front of him shifted uncomfortably, some covering their noses or casting wary glances over their shoulders. John was acutely aware of his appearance and odor. Months on the streets, with limited access to proper hygiene facilities, had left their mark. He hunched his shoulders, trying to make himself as small and unobtrusive as possible while he waited his turn. The line moved slowly, each passing minute intensifying John's hunger and anxiety. He could hear whispers and muttered comments from those around him, their words a painful reminder of his outsider status. Finally, John reached the front of the queue. He opened his mouth to place his order, but before he could speak, a commotion erupted behind him. "Excuse me," a woman's shrill voice cut through the air. "I can't stand this smell anymore. It's ruining my appetite." The server behind the counter looked up, his eyes narrowing as they landed on John. "Hey, homeless guy," he called out, his voice harsh and annoyed. "You're bothering my customers. Get out of here." John felt his face flush with shame. He wanted to explain, to show them the crisp bills in his pocket, and prove that he was a paying customer like anyone else. But as he turned to do so, he found himself face to face with the woman who had complained. Her nose was wrinkled in disgust as she looked him up and down. "You've got lice in your beard," she said, her voice dripping with revulsion as she pointed to him. "I can see them crawling from here." The whispers around John grew louder, people on the line beginning to shift and mutter amongst themselves. The atmosphere was turning hostile, and John knew from experience that these situations could escalate quickly. With a heavy heart, John stepped out of the line. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on the ground. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble." As he turned to leave, John cast one last longing glance towards the pizza oven. The sight of the flames and the clicking sound of the gas igniting click, click, click triggered another flash of memory. Suddenly, he wasn't in a pizza shop anymore, but back in a war zone, the ticking of the oven's ignition transforming into the ominous countdown of a bomb. A wave of nausea washed over John, his body reacting viscerally to the flood of traumatic memories. He stumbled away from the pizza place, his hunger forgotten in the face of this fresh onslaught of pain and fear. John's feet carried him away from the crowded storefront, his mind reeling from the humiliation and the triggered memories. He found himself back at the liquor store, the neon sign a beacon calling to him in his distress. A part of him knew this was wrong, that he was falling back into the destructive cycle that had brought him to this point. But the need to numb the pain, to escape the constant barrage of memories and rejection, was overwhelming. With trembling hands, John pushed open the door to the liquor store. The same clerk was behind the counter, his expression a mixture of recognition and resignation. John approached the counter, shame and desperation warring within him. I need," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. The clerk sighed, already reaching for the cheap bottles on the lower shelf. "How many?" he asked, his tone flat and disinterested. "3," John replied, the word feeling like ash in his mouth. He pulled out the crisp bills, the ones that were supposed to buy him food and hope. Instead, they were now being exchanged for temporary oblivion. The transaction was quick and silent. John handed over the 2 crisp $5 bills he had, receiving 3 bottles in return. "Can you open one for me?" he asked, his voice small and defeated. The clerk complied without comment, twisting off the cap and pushing the open bottle across the counter. John grabbed it, taking a long, desperate gulp before even leaving the store. As he stepped back out onto the street, the afternoon sun seemed to mock John's descent. He clutched his bottles close, already feeling the familiar warmth of alcohol spreading through his system. With nowhere else to go, John found himself heading back towards the spot where he had slept before. He had left his cardboard sign there, the pitiful marker of his territory in this unforgiving urban landscape. As he approached, John saw the restaurant door open. The three businessmen from earlier emerged, laughing and patting each other on the back. John froze, suddenly very aware of the bottles in his hands. The men noticed him, their conversation slowing. John saw a flicker of recognition cross the face of the man who approached him earlier, quickly followed by a wave of disappointment and regret. "See?" one of the other men said, gesturing towards John. "We told you. He used your money to buy those bottles. They're all the same." The man in the blue vest didn't respond, but John could see the regret in his eyes. There was something else there too, a searching look that made John feel as if he were being examined under a microscope. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken words and missed connections. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The two other businessmen climbed into their SUV, calling out a goodbye to their friend and reminding him to consider their investment proposal. The single man lingered for a moment longer, his gaze still fixed on John. Then, with a small shake of his head, he turned and walked to his own luxury SUV. As the cars pulled away, John was left standing on the sidewalk, the bottles in his hands feeling heavier than ever. He had started the day with a flicker of hope, a brief spark of possibility that maybe, just maybe, he could break free from the endless cycle of poverty and addiction. But now, with the afternoon sun sinking lower in the sky, he found himself right back where he had begun, empty-handed, with nothing but the familiar weight of the alcohol to keep him company through yet another long, solitary rest of the day. As the luxury SUVs disappeared around the corner, John felt the full weight of his choices bearing down on him. The alcohol he had consumed was working its way through his system, bringing with it a familiar, numbing warmth, but it couldn't quite dull the sharp edge of regret and self-loathing that cut through his consciousness. The sky above shifted unexpectedly, dark clouds rolling in and threatening rain at any moment. A biting wind against the remaining hot afternoon air began to pick up, slicing through John's threadbare clothes and making him shiver, even as sweat beaded on his brow. The harsh summer rain was closing in, and despite the alcohol coursing through his veins, he couldn't shake the cold that seemed to settle deep in his bones, an unwelcome visitor that refused to leave. John's eyes drifted to the bench by the restaurant where he had lay before. The restaurant's canopy extended just far enough to offer some protection from the impending rain. In his alcohol-addled state, John had forgotten the manager's earlier warning about sleeping there. All he could think about was finding a safe, dry spot to rest his weary body. With unsteady steps, John made his way to the bench. He lowered himself onto it with a groan, his joints protesting the movement. The world around him had taken on a hazy quality, the effects of the alcohol blurring the edges of reality. As he lay down, John's mind drifted. He thought about the man, about the look of recognition and disappointment in his eyes. There was something familiar about him, something John couldn't quite place. But trying to focus on the memory was like trying to grasp smoke. The harder he tried, the more it slipped away. The first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the canopy above John's head. The sound was oddly soothing, lulling him further into a state of half-consciousness. He clutched one of the bottles to his chest like a child might hold a teddy bear, seeking comfort in its presence. John's eyes grew heavy, the combination of alcohol and exhaustion pulling him towards sleep. He didn't dream this time, or if he did, the dreams were formless and fleeting, leaving no impression on his waking mind. He wasn't sure how long he had been asleep when a loud voice and a piercing whistle jolted him back to consciousness. John's eyes flew open, his heart racing as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. The restaurant owner stood over him, his face red with anger. Two police officers flanked him, one of them lowering a whistle from his lips. "Wake up!" the restaurant owner shouted, his voice filled with frustration and disgust. "How many times do I have to tell you people to stay away from my establishment?" John struggled to sit up, his head spinning from the abrupt awakening and the lingering effects of the alcohol. "Please," he mumbled, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "Please, the noise." One of the officers stepped forward, his expression a mixture of annoyance and resignation. "We've been trying to wake you for several minutes, sir. The whistle was a last resort." The restaurant owner turned to the officers, gesturing wildly at John. "This is what I'm talking about. These homeless people are ruining my business. I've got important investors, and I can't have this eyesore driving them away." John's foggy brain latched onto the word investors. He remembered the men from earlier, the way they had looked at him. Had they been considering buying this restaurant? Before John could fully process this thought, he felt strong hands gripping his arms. The officers were pulling him to his feet, the cold metal of handcuffs closing around his wrists. "No, please," John begged, the reality of the situation finally breaking through his alcohol-induced haze. "I'll go. I promise I won't come back. Just, please don't take me in." But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The officers began to lead him towards their waiting patrol car, their grip firm but not unnecessarily rough. John's legs felt like lead, each step a monumental effort. As they neared the police car, John's desperation grew. He knew that a night in jail, while providing a roof over his head, would only compound his problems. He'd lose what little he had, and the stigma of an arrest would make it even harder to find help or work in the future. Just as one of the officers reached for the car door, a familiar black SUV pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and the man in emerald blue vest stepped out, his expression a mixture of concern and determination. "Please stop," the man called out, his voice carrying an authority that made everyone pause. The restaurant owner's demeanor changed instantly upon seeing him. His anger gave way to an ingratiating smile. "Mr. Turner," he said, his tone suddenly respectful, "I didn't expect to see you back so soon. Is there a problem with our agreement?" The man shook his head, his eyes fixed on John. No problem. I'd like to speak with this man, if that's all right." The restaurant owner looked confused but nodded quickly. Of course. Officers, you can let him go. I'm withdrawing my complaint." The police officers exchanged a glance but complied, removing the handcuffs from John's wrists. "All right," one of them said, addressing John directly. "You're free to go, but I strongly suggest you find a shelter or somewhere else to sleep. We don't want to see you back here again, understood?" John nodded mutely, still trying to process the sudden turn of events. He rubbed his wrists where the handcuffs had been, wincing at the tenderness of his skin. The man thanked the officers and the restaurant owner, then turned his full attention to John. "Would you mind if we talked for a moment?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Perhaps we could sit on that bench." The restaurant owner paused for a moment, then, eager to impress the wealthy investor, nodded. "Of course, wouldn't want the rain to ruin your suit," he said. The man gave a grateful nod. "Just for a few minutes, we won't be long." As the man guided John back to the bench, the restaurant owner called out, "Mr. Turner, if you need anything at all, just let me know. I'll be inside." Mr. Turner nodded absently, his focus entirely on John. As they sat down, John found himself overwhelmed by the kindness in the young man's eyes. It had been so long since anyone had looked at him that way, like he was a person worthy of attention and care. "I have an important question for you," he said, his voice quiet but slightly hesitant. John nodded, encouraging him to continue. "What did you mean by that sign? Used to be someone." He gestured toward the sign, now trampled on the sidewalk, its cardboard soaked and crumpled as the summer rain battered it. John shifted uncomfortably on the bench, the weight of the man's question hanging heavy in the air between them. He hadn't expected such a direct inquiry, especially not from someone who, by all appearances, inhabited a world so far removed from his own. After a moment of hesitation, John cleared his throat. His voice, when he finally spoke, was rough and low. "I served this country," he said, the words coming out slowly, as if each one cost him great effort. "Risked my life in the army, that's it, nothing special anymore today, I guess." The young man leaned in, his eyes intense with a mixture of curiosity and something deeper, something John couldn't quite identify. "You were in the army?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "May I ask, what's your name?" John hesitated again, unused to such personal questions from strangers, but there was something about the man's demeanor that put him at ease. "John," he replied. "John Turner." At the sound of his name, the man's breath caught audibly. He cleared his throat, his hands fidgeting in his lap. John Turner, he repeated, as if testing the name on his tongue. I have another question, if you don't mind. Do you have a son? The question hit John like a physical blow. Memories he had long suppressed came flooding back. A little boy's laughter, bedtime stories, a tiny hand in his own. He nodded slowly, unable to speak past the lump that had formed in his throat. The man's voice was shaking now. Do you remember his name? John closed his eyes, allowing himself to fully remember for the first time in years. Yes, he whispered. His name was Frederick. I used to call him Fred. The silence that followed was deafening. John opened his eyes to find the man staring at him, tears streaming down his face. Before John could react, he had pulled him into a tight embrace. Dad, the young man choked out between sobs. It's me, I'm Frederick Turner, I'm your son. John sat frozen, his mind struggling to process what was happening. It couldn't be true. His son was just a little boy, not this successful businessman. And yet, those eyes, he knew those eyes. As Fred pulled back from the embrace, John studied his face more closely. The years had changed him, of course, but now that he was looking for it, John could see traces of the little boy he remembered in this man's features. Fred, John said, his own voice thick with emotion. But how? I don't understand. Fred wiped his eyes, trying to compose himself. I've been looking for you for years, he explained. After Mom left and you disappeared, I never gave up hope of finding you. But I never imagined it would be like this. John shook his head, still struggling to believe what was happening. It can't be, he muttered. Fred Turner is such a common name. Anyone could be called that. Fred reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. From it, he extracted a worn photograph. Look, he said, holding it out to John. With trembling hands, John took the photo. It showed a much younger version of himself, smiling broadly with a small boy perched on his shoulders. The sight of it brought a fresh wave of memories crashing over him. I remember this day, John said softly, tracing the image with his finger. We went to the park. My son wanted to feed the ducks, but he was afraid to get too close to the water. Fred nodded, a watery smile on his face. You held my hand the whole time, he added. You made me feel safe. As the reality of the situation began to sink in, John felt a wave of shame wash over him. Here was his son, successful and kind, and look at what had become of his father. A homeless alcoholic, a burden on society. Fred, John said, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry, I've let you down, I've let myself down, I don't deserve... But Fred cut him off. No, Dad, don't say that, we've found each other again, that's all that matters now. Just then, a loud clap of thunder shook the air, and the light drizzle turned into a heavy downpour. Fred looked up at the sky, then back at John. Come with me, he said, standing up and offering his hand. Let's get out of this rain, we have so much to talk about. John hesitated, looking down at his ragged clothes and dirty hands. I can't, he said. I don't belong in your world, I'll just embarrass you. Fred's expression softened. Dad, please, you're my father, nothing else matters. Let me help you like you helped me all those years ago. As another roll of thunder sounded, John made his decision. With a shaky nod, he reached out and took Fred's hand, allowing his son to help him to his feet. Wait, John said suddenly, remembering something. My cardboard, I can't leave it. Fred didn't hesitate. He jogged back to where John had left his sign, retrieving it despite the rain soaking his expensive suit. He returned with the soggy cardboard, handing it to John with a gentle smile. Together they made their way to Fred's SUV. As John sank into the plush leather seat, he felt as if he were entering another world. Fred climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. As they pulled away from the curb, Fred reached for his phone. With a few taps, music began to play through the car's speakers. John recognized the melody immediately. Used to be Someone. You remember this song? Fred asked, a hint of wonder in his voice. John nodded, a lump forming in his throat. I used to play it on the keyboard at home, he said softly. When you were little. As Fred began to sing along, his voice joining the recorded track, John felt something stir within him. His fingers twitched, muscle memory from years of playing the keyboard coming back to him. Hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, John began to sing too. His voice was rough and gravelly now, a far cry from what it had once been, but the notes were true. As their voices blended together, father and son sharing this moment of connection, John felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest for the first time in years. The rain continued to pour outside, but inside the car, a warmth began to grow. As they drove through the city streets, leaving behind the life John had known for so long, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for a new beginning. As Fred's SUV pulled up to a sprawling villa, John's eyes widened in disbelief. The property before him was a testament to luxury and success, a world away from the streets he had called home for so long. Manicured lawns stretched out on either side of a winding driveway, leading up to a house that seemed more like a mansion to John's eyes. "This is where you live?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Fred nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "It is," he confirmed, "and now it's your home too, Dad." As they exited the car, John felt a surge of pride mixed with a deep sense of unworthiness. His son had clearly done well for himself, building a life of comfort and prosperity. In contrast, John felt like a shabby intruder in this world of opulence. Fred led the way into the house, with John trailing hesitantly behind. They were greeted at the door by a tall, distinguished-looking man. Fred whispered something to him, and the man glanced at John with surprise, but then nodded and went about his duties. As John stepped inside, the interior was just as impressive as the exterior. High ceilings, tasteful artwork, and furniture that likely cost more than John had seen in years. "Let me show you to the living room," Fred said, guiding John through the spacious hallway. "There's something I want to show you." As they entered the living room, John's attention was immediately drawn to a grand piano sitting in the corner. It was a beautiful instrument, its polished surface gleaming in the soft light. John felt a pang of longing. It had been so long since he'd touched a piano. Fred walked over to a bookshelf and reached behind it, pulling out a dusty photo album. "I've kept these all these years," he explained, returning to where John stood. "I always hoped I'd be able to show them to you one day." They sat down on a plush sofa, and Fred opened the album. The first photo showed a much younger John, his arm around a small boy who was unmistakably Fred. Both were grinning widely at the camera. "This was at my 5th birthday party," Fred said softly. "Do you remember? You got me that toy truck I'd been begging for months." John nodded slowly, the memory coming back to him in fragments. "You played with that truck for hours," he recalled, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Wouldn't even stop for cake." They continued through the album, each photo bringing back a flood of memories. There were pictures of family picnics, Christmas mornings, and lazy summer days. With each image, John felt a mix of joy at the happy times and deep regret for the years he had missed. As they neared the end of the album, Fred paused, his expression growing more serious. "Dad," he began, "I want to show you something else." He stood up and walked over to a nearby desk, retrieving a tablet. As he returned to the sofa, he began to swipe through images on the screen. "This is my company," Fred explained, showing John pictures of sleek office buildings and groups of well-dressed professionals. "We've grown a lot over the past few years, but that's not all." He swiped to another set of images, these showing community centers, soup kitchens, and shelters. "These are the charities we support," Fred said, his voice filled with pride. "We've been able to help a lot of people." John listened in awe as Fred detailed the empire he had built, the businesses he ran, and the charitable work he was involved in. With each word, John felt a swell of pride in his son's accomplishments, but also a deepening sense of his own failures. "Fred," John interrupted, his voice thick with emotion, I'm so proud of you. You've done so much, become such an amazing man, but I can't stay here." Fred looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" John gestured around the room, then at himself. Look at me, Fred. I'm a mess. I've been living on the streets for years, drinking away what little money I could get my hands on. I don't deserve all this. I can't just jump back into your life and enjoy your success after all these years." Fred's expression softened. "Dad, please don't say that. You don't understand. Yes, I've built all this, but there's always been something missing. I've been living an empty life, always wondering where you were, if you were okay. I've spent years searching for you, hiring private investigators, following every lead I could find, but I never managed to find you." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "When I was little, Mom always told me that you left us. But as I got older, I found out the truth. I know about the war, Dad. I know about the struggles you faced when you came back. I know it was Mom who left, not you." John felt tears welling up in his eyes. All these years he had carried the guilt of abandoning his family, believing that his son must hate him for disappearing. To hear that Fred knew the truth, that he had been searching for him all this time, was almost too much to bear. "Even today," Fred continued, "I wouldn't have recognized you by how you looked. It was only when I saw your cardboard sign, 'Used to be someone,' that something clicked. It reminded me of your favorite song. That's what made me take a closer look." John sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything he was hearing. The idea that his son had been looking for him all these years, that he hadn't been forgotten or abandoned, was overwhelming. "Dad," Fred said, reaching out to take John's hand, "I know it won't be easy. I know you've been through hell, but please, stay here with me. Let me help you. We can get you the support you need, therapy for the PTSD, treatment for the alcohol addiction. You deserve a chance to rest, to heal. After everything you sacrificed for our country and for our family, it's the least I can do." John felt a lump forming in his throat. The offer was more than he could have ever dreamed of, more than he felt he deserved. But the love and determination in Fred's eyes made it impossible to refuse. "Okay," John whispered, his voice barely audible. "Okay, son, I'll stay, but you gotta teach me how to live in this life. In your world. You see, I'm an old man now, and I might be slow to learn." Fred's face broke into a wide smile, and he pulled John into a tight embrace. As John returned the hug, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Hope for a better future, hope for healing, hope for a chance to rebuild the relationship with his son that he thought he had lost forever. As they pulled apart, both men wiping tears from their eyes, John's stomach let out a loud growl. Fred chuckled, the sound breaking the emotional tension in the room. "You must be starving," Fred said. "How about I make us something to eat? Do you remember the tomato soup and omelette you used to make for me when I was little? I think I can recreate it." John's eyes widened in surprise. "You remember that?" Fred nodded, a fond smile on his face. "Of course, it was my favorite meal. You used to say it was the perfect comfort food for any occasion." As Fred stood up to head to the kitchen, John felt a wave of nostalgia wash over him. He could almost taste the creamy tomato soup and fluffy omelette, could almost feel the warmth of their old kitchen as he cooked for his young son. "Fred," John called out as his son reached the doorway. Fred turned back, an expectant look on his face. "Thank you," John said simply, pouring all of his gratitude and love into those two words. Fred's smile widened. "Welcome home, Dad," he replied before disappearing into the kitchen. As the aroma of simmering tomato soup began to waft through the house, John found himself drawn to the kitchen. He stood in the doorway, watching as Fred moved confidently around the space, chopping vegetables and stirring the pot on the stove. "Need any help?" John asked hesitantly, feeling both eager to contribute and unsure of his place in this unfamiliar environment. Fred looked up, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Sure, Dad. Why don't you come taste the soup? See if it needs anything." John stepped into the kitchen, approaching the stove with a mix of anticipation and trepidation. Fred handed him a small tasting spoon, and John carefully sipped the rich red liquid. The flavor exploded on his tongue, bringing with it a flood of memories. Cozy evenings in their old kitchen, Fred as a little boy perched on a stool, watching intently as John stirred the pot. The comfort of a warm meal after a long day. The simple joy of cooking for someone you love. "Well?" Fred asked, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "How is it?" John swallowed, blinking back tears. "It's perfect," he said softly. "Just like I remember." Fred beamed, clearly pleased by the praise. "I've been practicing," he admitted. "I wanted to get it just right. Every time I missed you, I would make this soup." The weight of those words hung in the air between them, a reminder of the years lost and the miracle of their reunion. John felt a lump forming in his throat, overwhelmed by the love and dedication his son had shown. "Fred," John called. Fred turned down the heat on the stove and let it simmer. He gave his father his full attention. "What is it, Dad?" John took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he needed to say. "The street. It's been cruel, Fred. Even with the money you gave me earlier, I couldn't buy food. No one would serve someone who looked like me." He paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "And there's more. The war. It left scars, son. Not just on the outside. I have episodes. PTSD, they call it now. Sometimes I can't control myself. I've been using alcohol to numb the pain, to quiet the memories. I don't want to bring all that chaos into your life." Fred listened intently, his eyes filled with compassion. When John finished speaking, Fred stepped forward and placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "Dad," he said softly, "I know it won't be easy, but we'll face this together. There are programs to help veterans like you, treatments for PTSD and addiction. The government has systems in place to support those who've sacrificed so much for our country. We'll get you the help you need." John felt tears welling up in his eyes, overwhelmed by his son's unwavering support. "You'd do all that for me? After everything?" Fred's grip on John's shoulder tightened. "Of course I would. You're my father. You deserve a chance to rest, to heal. We can start building a better future together. You've earned that after everything you've been through." Just then the butler appeared again in the kitchen doorway. He wore a crisp suit and carried himself with an air of quiet efficiency. "Excuse me, Mr. Turner," the man said, addressing Fred. "I've prepared the guest room and warm bath as requested. Is there anything else you need?" Fred turned to the man with a smile. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison. Actually, there is one more thing. I'd like you to meet someone." He gestured to John. "This is my father, John Turner. Dad, this is Robert Harrison, my assistant." Mr. Harrison's eyes widened slightly in surprise, but he quickly composed himself. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Turner," he said, extending his hand to John. John hesitated for a moment before shaking the offered hand, acutely aware of the contrast between his rough, weathered appearance and Mr. Harrison's polished demeanor. Fred continued, his voice taking on a more formal tone. "Mr. Harrison, I want you to understand that my father is to be treated with the utmost respect and care. He should be afforded the same considerations as myself. Is that clear?" "Of course, Mr. Turner," Mr. Harrison replied without hesitation. "I'll ensure that everything is taken care of." Then the man turned to John. "Sir, if you'll follow me, I'll help you to your room and warm bath." John looked at Fred, who smiled at him. "Go on, Dad. The soup will take some time to simmer. You go and enjoy your bath." As Mr. Harrison led the way, John turned to Fred one last time, a mix of emotions playing across his face. "Thank you, Fred. You don't have to do all this. You don't know how proud I am of you right now." Fred smiled, and John followed Mr. Harrison up the glass stairs to the bedroom. After what could have been an hour or so, John returned to the living room and made his way to the kitchen, now changed into fresh clothes and looking much cleaner. He had shaved and was wearing comfortable evening loungewear that Mr. Harrison prepared for him. As John fumbled for the right words to express his gratitude to his son, the timer on the stove chimed. Fred turned back to the soup, giving it a final stir. "I think dinner's ready. The soup has been reduced well," he said with a smile. "Why don't you go ahead and settle in the dining room? I'll bring everything out in a minute." As Fred emerged from the kitchen, carrying a tray loaded with steaming bowls of soup and a plate of golden omelettes, John couldn't help but smile. For the first time in years, he had a chance to experience a reunion, a family dinner, something warm and proper to fill both his stomach and his soul. Sitting together with his son, He knew that he wasn't just someone from the past anymore. He was a father reunited with his son, a man being given a second chance at life. As they began to eat, the rich flavors of the soup bringing back a flood of happy memories, John made a silent promise to himself and to Fred. He would work hard to overcome his demons and become the father Fred deserved. As the evening progressed, John found himself settling into a comfortable rhythm with Fred. The initial awkwardness of their reunion began to fade, replaced by a warmth that felt both familiar and new. They sat at the dining table long after they had finished eating, talking and laughing, filling in the gaps of their years apart. As their conversation reached a natural pause, John's gaze was drawn to the grand piano on the other side of the room, the one he had noticed when he first entered the house. It stood there, its polished surface gleaming softly in the dim light. Fred followed his father's gaze and smiled. "Do you still play?" he asked softly. John shook his head, a wistful expression crossing his face. "It's been years," he admitted. "I'm not sure I remember how—" Fred stood up, extending a hand to his father. "Why don't you give it a try? I'd love to hear you play again." Hesitantly, John rose from his chair and followed Fred to the piano. He ran his fingers lightly over the smooth keys, memories of countless hours spent at a similar instrument flooding back to him. "I'm not sure," John began, but Fred cut him off with a gentle squeeze of his shoulder. "Just try, Dad, it's all right." Unable to resist the encouragement in his son's eyes, John sat down on the piano bench. He lifted the fallboard, revealing the full expanse of black and white keys. For a moment, he just sat there, his hands hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. Then slowly, he began to play. The first few notes were hesitant, his fingers stiff and unpracticed. But as he continued, muscle memory began to take over. The melody of "Used to Be Someone" flowed from his fingertips, filling the room with its bittersweet tune. Fred stood nearby, watching in awe as his father played. The music seemed to transform John, erasing years of hardship from his face. For a moment, Fred could see the man his father used to be, strong, confident, full of life. As the last notes faded away, John looked up at Fred, a mix of surprise and joy on his face. "I didn't think I could still do that," he said softly. Fred's eyes were shining with unshed tears. "That was beautiful, Dad. I've missed hearing you play." John felt a lump forming in his throat. "I've missed it too," he admitted. "More than I realized." As they stood there, the emotional weight of the moment hanging between them, John suddenly felt overwhelmed by everything that had happened. The whirlwind of the day, from the depths of despair on the streets to this moment of connection with his son, came crashing down on him. "Fred," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want you to know how grateful I am, for everything, for finding me, for bringing me here, for giving me another chance. I know I have a long way to go, but I promise you I'm going to do everything I can to get better, to be the father you deserve." Fred stepped forward, pulling his father into a tight embrace. "I know you will, Dad," he said softly, "and I'll be here every step of the way. We're in this together now." When exhaustion finally began to set in, Fred walked John to his new room. It was spacious and comfortable, a far cry from the park benches and alleyways John had called home for so long. As John settled into the soft bed, he found himself marveling at the turn his life had taken. Just that morning, he had been a homeless man, lost and alone, convinced that his life held no value. Now he was reunited with his son, given a second chance at life, at family, at redemption. The familiar melody of "Used to Be Someone" played softly in John's mind as he drifted off to sleep. But this time, the song didn't fill him with regret for what he had lost. Instead, it felt like a promise, a reminder that while he used to be someone, he could be someone again. And with that thought, John Turner, no longer homeless, no longer alone, fell into the most peaceful sleep he had known in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new opportunities. And for the first time in a very long time, John was looking forward to facing them.